that the UK is just not prepared for the impact of climate breakdown, and it's come from a source that you tend to believe. It's come from the National Fire Chiefs Council, who said the ability of fire services to tackle weather-related emergencies was at risk, despite them often being the primary frontline response to major weather events, including flooding, fires caused by heat waves and storm-related emergencies. Let's speak to Natalie Bennett, who is a Green Party peer and the party's former leader. I don't suppose that surprises you, does it?
Sadly, no, Ian. And I think of back when I was party leader and since visiting so many communities around the country, I think of Lancaster after Storm Desmond in 2015, when there was a palpable sense of shock. They went without electricity for a couple of days after flooding, and people realised just how difficult things could be, how much we need to focus on resilience. And I think the fire chiefs are absolutely right. I mean, they're talking very specifically about them having better forecasting capabilities. They're talking about more resources. But also, I think they're absolutely right to focus on local community resilience. We need strong local plans. We need communities that are equipped to deal with whatever the weather is increasingly going to be throwing at us. And we're not ready for it.
How can we be more prepared, Natalie?
Well, I think the fire chiefs are talking about some specific forecasting capabilities and that. But what I learnt from Storm Desmond, and after a year or so after that, we held an event in Lancaster with the Greenhouse think tank, learning from other communities that had been hit by weather-related disasters. Because, of course, we think about flooding a lot. This is the season for it to think about flooding, but we've also really got to be concerned about fires, something that hasn't been a concern generally previously in Britain. But wildfires, and of course we're seeing around the world wildfires becoming much more threatening, much worse. What we've got to get is the resources to deal with the big disasters, but also to cope afterwards. We need strong community resilience, resources built in at the local level, because very often, the centre, the big city nearby is not going to be immediately able to help. A village or a small town needs to be able to look after itself. And that, when we're talking in the context of the government's devolution plans, which is actually going to even further centralise power and resources right around the country, that's a real concern.
Where are the major wildfires? I must admit, I don't remember reporting on many of these things. Where are they?
Well, I think if you remember recently, a couple of years ago in London, we had what was essentially a grass fire that got out of control.
That was the 41 degrees, wasn't it?
Yeah, and so that's going to become more and more the new normal. And you've just been talking about accents. For anyone who's wondering, my accent comes from Australia originally.
Never lost it.
I know a great deal about wildfires, as we call them, bushfires in Australia. I grew up with them. I've seen them close hand. I've driven up a road where a fire has come leaping through totally with no hope of control. And of course, it's what the Americans have just been seeing. And we're not used to thinking about that in the UK as something that threatens us. But, we're actually looking at 40-degree temperatures being regular in the south of England, the Met Office says, and also a quarter more rainfall. Now, you might think that's an advantage, but if you have more rainfall, you have more vegetation growing, which can be more fuel for the fire in hot, dry conditions afterwards.
I'm speaking to Natalie Bennett. She was the leader of the Green Party. Can I ask you a question about the subject that we're touching on now? Keir Starmer going to Europe to try and wangle some sort of deal on something, but I don't think he's going to get anywhere close to rejoining the EU. For you, 5 years on, what's changed?
Well, I think it has been extremely negative for Britain, and disagreeing with your previous caller, I think one of the great tragedies is that young British people now have fewer freedoms and opportunities than their parents had. This is something when I go into schools, universities and colleges, as I do often. Young people really are angry about the fact that their parents had the chance to just up sticks and go and move to Europe if they want to, travel extensively, maybe meet a European, fall in love. We've lost all those opportunities.
Who do you blame?
Well, I think we've got some right-wing politicians who I might particularly lay the blame on. Boris Johnson, I remember the visible signs of shock in his face after he won the referendum the next morning when it wasn't expected, and there clearly wasn't a plan. I also think there wasn't any thought given to, I work with the Horticultural Trade Association, and they're hugely concerned about the problems they've got moving stock into the UK. We've got lots of small, medium-sized businesses that are really struggling struggling to export to the UK, to the Europe as they used to from the UK. There was no plan. There was no thought about what was happening. There was no real explanation. And I'm afraid also, I think we had a very poor quality of debate during the Brexit referendum. Lots of these issues were predicted. I was talking about them during the referendum campaign, but people weren't given the full facts.
Thank you for coming on, Natalie. Natalie Bennett, Green Party peer and the party's former leader. So there we are.